Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Nature Channel. Find yourself a comfortable position right now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest softly wherever they fall, and take one slow, easy breath, just one. Feel it move through you like a quiet wave, and then let it go. Tonight, we are going somewhere extraordinary together, somewhere ancient and warm and wonderfully alive. We are going to follow the world's most quietly remarkable rivers. Rivers that have been flowing through stone and shadow and forest for longer than anyone can truly remember. Rivers that carry warmth inside them, not from the sun above, but from something deep and slow and generous beneath the earth. These are rivers that boil naturally, fed by the hidden fires of the planet itself, rising up through layers of ancient rock to meet the open air as steam and shimmer and soft, curling mist. You don't need to go anywhere or do anything right now. Just let the story come to you. Somewhere in the depths of the earth, far below anything you have ever walked across, there is heat. Not the aggressive, uncomfortable heat of a summer afternoon, but something older and much more patient. It is the heat that has been sitting inside our planet since the very beginning, since the earth first gathered itself together from dust and gas and slowly became the round, spinning, ocean-covered world it is today. That heat never left. It simply settled deeper, pressing gently upward in certain places, finding cracks and channels in the rock, warming water that seeps down from rain and snowmelt above. And in some very special places, that warmed water finds its way back up to the surface and becomes a river. These rivers exist all over the world. Some of them are tucked away in remote forests where very few people have ever walked. Some of them flow down the sides of volcanic mountains, threading between ferns and mosses that have adapted over many generations to love the warmth. Some of them are famous, visited by people who travel long distances just to stand at their edges and feel the soft cloud of steam on their faces. And some of them are so quiet and so hidden that they seem almost like a secret the earth is keeping, telling it only to the trees and the birds and the patient stone. The most famous of these remarkable rivers is found in the Amazon, not in the wide, famous main channel that most people picture when they hear that word, but deep inside the Peruvian jungle, far from any city or road, in a place where the forest is so thick and green and full of life that the sky above sometimes disappears entirely beneath the canopy. This river is called Shanai Timpishka, which in the local Ashaninka language means something that translates softly and beautifully as boiled with the heat of the sun. The people who have lived near this river for generations gave it that name, and it is a name that feels completely right when you stand beside it and watch the mist rise. Shanai Timpishka is about 6.5 kilometers long. That is not enormous as rivers go, but what it lacks in length, it more than makes up for in warmth. The water temperature along most of its length sits between 45 and 90 degrees Celsius, which means that in many stretches, if you were to lower your hand into it, you would feel not a cool forest stream, but something closer to a deep, enveloping bath, or, in its hotter sections, something that would encourage you to step back and simply admire from the bank instead. The river does not rush. It moves with a kind of slow, deliberate grace, like something that knows it has nowhere urgent to be. Let yourself breathe slowly now. There is no hurry here either. The geologist who brought Chennai Timpishka to wider attention, a man named Andres Russo, first heard about it as a child from his grandfather, who described it almost like a legend. A river in the Amazon where the water boils, where animals sometimes fall in and do not come out again, where the mist hangs always above the surface like a low, permanent cloud. For years, Russo thought of it as a story, the kind of thing grandparents tell on quiet evenings. Then, as a grown man studying the geology of Peru, he began asking questions. He asked scientists and geologists, and most of them said such a thing was probably not real. A boiling river in the middle of the Amazon, without a volcano nearby? That was not how things were supposed to work. But Russo kept asking, and eventually an aunt told him she had actually been there. She took him to the forest, and the river was real. Standing at the edge of Chennai Timpishka for the first time, Russo described feeling something he had never quite felt before, a sense of smallness that was not frightening at all, but peaceful. The forest was enormous around him. The steam rose in soft, transparent curtains. The river moved in its slow, warm way between banks of dark mud and tangled roots. And underneath everything, beneath the sound of water and the distant calls of birds, hidden in the canopy, there was a deep, almost subsonic hum that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. The earth, breathing. If you close your eyes for just a moment, right now, you might be able to imagine it. The air around you warm and damp. The green of the jungle pressing close on all sides, soft and enormous. The surface of the river catching what little light filters down through the trees, making it glow faintly, like something illuminated from within. Most rivers get their warmth from sunlight, falling on their surfaces on warm afternoons, heating the top few centimeters of water before evening comes and cools everything again. Chennai Timpishka is different. Its heat comes from below. The current scientific understanding is that the water originates as rain that falls on the Andes Mountains far to the west, soaks into the earth, travels downward through rock formations that bring it close to geothermal heat sources, and then slowly works its way back up along fault lines, deep cracks in the Earth's crust, eventually emerging as these quietly astonishing warm springs that feed the river's flow. The river runs into a larger, cooler river downstream. Where the two meet, the water swirls and mingles, warm and cool together, and the steam above that meeting place rises in especially beautiful, winding shapes before it dissolves into the forest air. Along the banks of Chennai Timpishka, the plants have made their own adjustments. Mosses that love moisture and warmth coat the rocks in thick, soft cushions of green and gold. Ferns uncurl in the humid air, their new fronds bright and almost translucent, like small living spirals that haven't quite decided to open all the way yet. The roots of trees nearby have grown in ways that seem to reach toward the warmth, as if the trees themselves know something good is nearby and want to be close to it. It is a place that feels, in the best and most restful way, like the earth is being generous. We will stay with these remarkable rivers for a while tonight, moving gently from one to another, from one warm and steaming shore to the next, letting each one show us something quiet and wonderful. There are many of them, more than you might expect, scattered across the world in places both famous and forgotten, each one with its own temperature, its own color, its own community of plants and creatures that have learned to love the warmth. For now, though, let Shanai Timpishka hold you softly. Imagine the steam rising around you, not hot enough where you are standing to be uncomfortable, but warm, pleasantly, gently warm, like the air near a fireplace on a slow evening when there is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. The river moves past you with that quiet, unhurried grace. The forest breathes above you. Somewhere far above the canopy, the sky is probably a deep, easy blue. But you cannot see it from here. You don't need to. Everything you need is already close. The mist above Shanai Timpishka never quite disappears, even on the warmest jungle afternoons, when the sun has found its way down through gaps in the canopy, and the air itself feels thick with warmth and growing things. The river keeps breathing its soft steam upward. It is one of the things that makes this place feel unlike anywhere else. That constant, gentle exhalation, as if the river is alive in a way that goes beyond simply flowing from one place to another. Let your own breath settle now. There is something very natural about breathing slowly in a place like this. The river has its deepest and hottest section near its source, where the geothermal springs feed directly into the flow. Here, the water reaches temperatures that sit just below a full rolling boil, close enough that the surface shimmers and moves in ways that remind you of a pot just beginning to warm on a stove, but slower, quieter, without any urgency. This section of the river is sacred to the Ashaninka people who have known it for generations. Their relationship with Shanai Timpishka is not one of scientific measurement or geological explanation. It is something older and more personal than that. The Ashaninka call the spirit of the river Yakumama, which means Mother of the Waters. In their understanding, she is a great and ancient being who lives at the river's source, a massive, warm presence that keeps the water alive and moving and warm. When Andres Russo asked local people about the river's heat, many of them spoke of Yakumama without hesitation as the most natural explanation in the world. And there is something in that explanation, something about a living, breathing, caring presence beneath the water that science, for all its precision, has not quite managed to replace with something equally satisfying. Both things can be true at once. The geology can be real, and the feeling of something ancient and generous beneath the surface can also be real. They are simply two different languages describing the same quiet wonder. Around the world, cultures that live near naturally heated waters have almost always developed stories about them. Hot springs and warm rivers are places where the boundary between the surface world and whatever lies beneath seems a little thinner, a little more permeable. In many traditions, these are healing places, ceremonial places, places where the earth offers something to the people living nearby. Warmth, mineral-rich water, the scent of steam on a cold morning, the comfort of something warm in a world that is often cold. In Japan, where geothermally heated water is extraordinarily common and deeply woven into daily life, the tradition of onsen, soaking in natural hot spring water, goes back at least 1,500 years and possibly much longer. The Japanese concept of onsen is not simply about the physical sensation of warm water on tired muscles, though that is certainly part of it. It is also about stillness, about the particular quality of time that exists when you are immersed in warm water and there is steam in the air and perhaps snow falling softly outside, or cherry blossoms or autumn leaves drifting down from trees that have turned every color between yellow and deep red. Japan sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, that vast curving zone of geological activity that runs around much of the Pacific Ocean, where tectonic plates meet and press against each other, where volcanoes and earthquakes and geothermal heat are all part of ordinary life. The island chain that makes up Japan is particularly rich in geothermal activity, and there are more than 3,000 onsen locations across the country, from the northernmost reaches of Hokkaido down to the tropical warmth of Okinawa. Some of these hot springs flow directly into rivers, creating stretches of naturally warm water that animals have discovered for themselves, quite independently of any human invitation. In the mountains of Nagano Prefecture, in the deep snowy forests of central Japan, there is a population of Japanese macaques, also known as snow monkeys, who have become famous the world over for one particular habit. They soak in hot springs. The Jigokudani Monkey Park, whose name translates delightfully as Hell Valley, referring to the steam that rises from the ground in winter, not to anything frightening, sits beside a river fed by geothermal springs. The macaques began using the hot spring pool decades ago, and now it is simply part of their winter routine. A warm, steaming pool in the middle of a snow-covered forest, filled with monkeys sitting with an expression of profound, uncomplicated satisfaction on their faces. If you have ever seen photographs of the snow monkeys of Jigokudani, you will know the look. Eyes half closed, faces relaxed, the occasional slow blink. They look, in those moments, like creatures who have figured out something important about the relationship between warmth and rest and letting everything else be for a while. You might feel something similar right now if you let yourself. The water in Jigokudani flows at around 40 degrees Celsius, warm enough to be deeply comfortable. cool enough to sit in for a while without discomfort. The macaques sometimes stay in the pool for hours on cold winter days, with snow falling around them and their fur steaming gently as they move through the water. Young macaques have learned the behavior from their mothers. Older ones sit with the settled authority of long practice. Sometimes they groom each other in the water, turning to pick gently through each other's fur with the focused, unhurried attention that is one of the most soothing things to watch in the natural world. Grooming in primates and in many other animals is not just about cleanliness. It is about connection. It releases tension. It says, quietly and without words, I am here, and you are here, and everything is fine. The warm water and the soft attention and the snow falling on the steam. It is one of nature's most complete pictures of comfort. Rivers fed by geothermal springs often carry dissolved minerals with them, pulled up from deep in the rock as the water travels its long, slow journey from rainfall to underground warmth to surface flow. These minerals give thermally heated rivers and springs their characteristic colors, and they are colors that you might not expect from water. In Yellowstone National Park in the United States, the hot springs and geothermal pools are famous for their almost impossibly vivid colors. Rings of deep blue at the center, shading outward through turquoise and green and yellow and orange and rust red, like the cross-section of some extraordinary planet. These colors come from communities of heat-loving microorganisms called thermophiles, creatures so small they are invisible without a microscope, but present in such vast numbers that they paint the landscape in shades that seem to belong to another world entirely. The Grand Prismatic Spring at Yellowstone is the largest hot spring in the United States and the third largest in the world. Seen from above, from a hiking trail that rises to a viewpoint above the thermal basin, it looks like a painting made by someone who had never been told that water is not supposed to be those colors. The center is a deep, clear, almost otherworldly blue, because the water there is too hot even for the heat-loving microbes, around 87 degrees Celsius. And so it is pure and uncolored. Moving outward as the temperature drops, the microbes begin to appear, and with them the colors, greens and yellows and oranges that shift with the seasons, because different communities of microbes thrive in different temperatures and change their colors slightly depending on how much sunlight they are receiving. When you look at the Grand Prismatic Spring, you are seeing something that has been happening for tens of thousands of years, completely independent of any human attention or intervention. The colors were there long before anyone arrived with a camera. They will be there long after any photograph fades. There is something deeply peaceful about that continuity, about things that simply continue season after season, warming and cooling and changing color and warming again. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through nature's quiet wonders, you might like to check out the playlist on this channel. There are other stories there waiting for you, each one a different place a different kind of peace, ready whenever you need them. The steam above Yellowstone's geothermal features is sometimes visible from miles away, rising in soft columns above the flat, open landscape of the park. On cold mornings, when the air temperature drops well below freezing, the contrast between the frozen ground and the warm, steaming water creates something almost surreal. Ice and snow right at the edge of water, too warm to freeze, a border between two worlds sitting quietly side by side. Bison, who live year-round in Yellowstone through winters that can be brutally cold, have learned to graze near the geothermal areas, where the ground stays warm enough that the grass beneath the snow is easier to reach. You might imagine them there in the pale winter light, great dark shapes moving slowly through the steam, their breath adding its own small clouds to the already misty air. Let that image settle softly over you, the cold air, the warm ground, the bison moving in their unhurried way, the steam rising all around. Everything exactly as it has been for a very long time. Water remembers where it has been. That sounds like something from an old story, a gentle piece of folklore passed down around fires in the long evenings of winter. But in a sense, it is simply accurate. Water that has traveled deep into the earth and spent years, sometimes hundreds of years, sometimes thousands, moving slowly through rock and heat, carries something of that journey back to the surface with it. It carries warmth, yes, and dissolved minerals, and sometimes gases that bubble gently upward through the water and break at the surface in small, quiet sighs. But it also carries in its chemistry a kind of record of where it has been and what it has touched. Scientists can measure the age of geothermal water, how long it has been underground, how deep it traveled, what kinds of rock it passed through. Some of the hot spring water rising to the surface in places like Iceland or New Zealand has been underground for decades. Some of it has been away from the open air for centuries. Rising through faults and cracks in the rock, it finally emerges blinking into the light, warm and mineral-rich and faintly steaming, as if surprised to find itself in the open again after so long in the dark. There is something very calming about that kind of time. The slow, patient movement of water through stone over centuries, guided by nothing more complicated than the pull of gravity and the push of heat from below. Iceland is one of the most geothermally extraordinary places on Earth. It sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, the underwater mountain chain that runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, where two great tectonic plates are very, very slowly pulling apart from each other. As they separate, magma rises to fill the gap and heat spreads upward through the overlying rock. Iceland is essentially a piece of that ridge that rose above sea level, built almost entirely from volcanic activity, and it sits in a permanent state of gentle geothermal abundance. The result is that hot water and steam seep out of the ground all over Iceland, in thousands of different places, at thousands of different temperatures. The Icelandic landscape in geothermally active areas smells faintly of sulfur, a warm mineral smell that is so associated with these places that for people who have visited Iceland, catching that scent anywhere else in the world is enough to bring the whole landscape rushing back. The smell of deep earth released into cold northern air. Iceland heats about 90% of its homes using geothermal energy. Warm water pumped up from underground and circulated through radiators and hot water taps, turning the heat of the Earth's interior directly into comfortable rooms and warm showers without burning anything, without any smoke or flame, simply using what the Earth offers. The capital city of Reykjavik, which might reasonably be expected to be a cold and difficult place to live, given its latitude just below the Arctic Circle, is instead known for being one of the most comfortable and pleasant cities in the world, in large part because of the constant, generous warmth flowing up from beneath it. The Blue Lagoon, perhaps Iceland's most famous geothermal feature, is a large pool of milky blue-white water fed by runoff from a geothermal power plant nearby. The water is rich in silica and sulfur, two minerals that give it its extraordinary color and its famously soft texture. People travel from all over the world to float in it, and there is something about floating in warm, silky, gently steaming water while cold northern wind moves overhead that is as close to perfect rest as many people have ever found. But Iceland has quieter, more hidden versions of this experience too. Along rivers fed by geothermal springs, there are stretches of warm water that most visitors never find. Places you reach on foot, following a trail through lava fields where the rock is black and rough and strange, until you hear the sound of water and find a river running warm and clear over smooth stones, steam rising from it in the cold air. Absolutely nobody else around, just you and the water and the wind and the enormous Icelandic sky above. Let your breath go slow and even now, like that river. No hurry, nowhere to be. New Zealand is another country shaped by its position on the edge of tectonic plates, and it has its own remarkable collection of naturally heated rivers and hot springs. The central North Island, particularly the area around the town of Rotorua, sits above a volcanically active zone that keeps the ground warm and the water interesting across an enormous area. The Waikite Valley, the Waiatapu Thermal Wonderland, the steaming cliffs of Orake Korako. Each of these places has its own character, its own particular palette of colors and temperatures, its own smell and sound and atmosphere. The Waikato River, which is the longest river in New Zealand, is fed in part by geothermal springs along its course. Its water temperature is slightly higher than you might expect for a river of its size and location, warmed gently by the geothermal activity beneath the North Island's landscape. Eels live in the Waikato River, long, smooth, patient creatures that have been navigating these warm waters for longer than anyone has been keeping records. The Maori people of New Zealand have deep cultural connections to the Waikato River and to the concept of rivers as living entities, as taonga, treasures, that belong not to any individual or government, but to the land itself and to the people who are its guardians. There are many rivers in the world where geothermal warmth and cultural significance intertwine like this, where the heat that comes from the earth has made the water sacred as well as warm. In the Tibetan plateau, where hot springs bubble up through the extreme altitude and thin air, monasteries have been built nearby for centuries, their monks using the warm water for both practical and ceremonial purposes. The steam from the springs drifting across courtyards where prayers flutter on small flags in the wind. In Ethiopia, in the Afar region, where the earth is in the process of very slowly tearing itself apart as two tectonic plates separate, the geothermal activity is extraordinarily intense. The Danakil Depression, one of the most remote and extreme landscapes on Earth, contains boiling lakes, bubbling mud pools, and rivers of brilliant yellow and green fed by sulfur springs, making it look more like a painting of an alien world than anywhere on Earth. The colors are extraordinary, almost aggressive in their vividness. Acid yellow sulfur crystals building up around the edges of boiling pools, electric green water flowing over orange mineral deposits, everything smelling strongly of the deep earth and reflecting the sky in colors you would not think the sky could be. It is not a comfortable place in the ordinary sense, but it is undeniably, overwhelmingly astonishing. The earth showing itself without any restraint, doing exactly what it does and not apologizing for any of it. You might like to leave a comment below if you find these kinds of hidden, extraordinary places as calming to think about as I do. There is something about knowing the world contains such things, quietly existing even when nobody is watching, that makes the night feel softer somehow, back to something gentler now, back to the warm rivers of the Amazon, where the air is thick with moisture and green light and the sound of things growing. One of the remarkable features of Chennai Timpishka is how the local wildlife has found its own ways of relating to the warm water. The hot sections of the river are too warm for most fish, but where the temperature drops toward the edges and the downstream sections, life returns gradually. Frogs sit at the edges of the river in the warm, humid air, their small hands gripping the moss on rocks with that careful, relaxed grip that frogs seem to have perfected over hundreds of millions of years of practice. Birds come to the river's edge to drink from the cooler sections and sometimes to bathe, shaking water from their feathers with those rapid, joyful shudders that birds do when they are absolutely comfortable and want the water to go exactly everywhere. The sounds around Chennai Timpishka are layered and complex, the way jungle sounds always are. Underneath everything, the water. Above that, the insects, not loud or intrusive, but present. A constant soft texture of sound, like the forest breathing through 1,000 tiny voices. Then, the birds appearing and disappearing from the soundscape as they move through the canopy, each call a different shape of sound, some high and clear, some deep and resonant, some that repeat in patient sequences like someone trying very gently to be understood. And above all of this, the trees themselves, which are not silent even when there is no wind. Leaves shift against each other. A small animal moves through branches somewhere high above, and the canopy sways very slightly, rippling the green light below. A fruit drops somewhere in the distance with a soft, final thud. Everything continuing exactly as it always has. There is a river in Chile running down the side of a volcano called Villarrica that is warm enough in places to bathe in, fed by snowmelt that passes through volcanic rock and absorbs heat before reaching the surface again. The volcano itself, one of South America's most active, wears a permanent cap of snow and ice at its summit, while geothermal vents on its flanks breathe heat up through the forest. The river that runs from its slopes, called the Liucura, passes through a landscape of monkey puzzle trees. Those ancient, extraordinary conifers with their geometric, scale-covered branches that make them look like trees imagined by someone who had never quite seen a tree, but had a very detailed description of one. The monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria araucana, is one of the oldest tree species still living on Earth. It has been growing in essentially its current form for more than 200 million years, which means it existed when dinosaurs walked the Earth, when the continents were arranged differently, when the world was in many respects unrecognizable compared to the world of today. And it has been quietly standing on the slopes of Chilean volcanoes through all of it, through ice ages and eruptions and the slow drift of continents, growing its patient, spiny spirals, dropping its large, edible seeds, and living in the particular unhurried way of trees that have found a place that suits them and have no intention of going anywhere else. The seeds of the monkey puzzle tree, called piñones, have been an important food source for the indigenous Mapuche and Pehuenche peoples of Chile and Argentina for thousands of years. Families would gather under the trees in autumn to collect the fallen seeds, which are large and nutritious and can be eaten raw or roasted or ground into flour for bread. The trees themselves were regarded with a reverence that makes complete sense when you stand beneath one and look up through its extraordinary architecture. The symmetrical, repeating patterns of branches reaching outward and upward, each one ending in a dense cluster of sharp-pointed scales. The whole structure creating a kind of natural geometry that seems to exist somewhere between the organic and the architectural. The Liucura River runs warm through forests of these ancient trees, and people have been going there to soak in its thermally warmed sections for as long as anyone can remember. The local term for natural hot bathing spots is termas, thermal baths, and along the river there are places where the warm water pools in sheltered spots between boulders, perfect in size and temperature for sitting quietly in while the forest moves around you. There is a particular quality to the light in a southern beach and monkey puzzle forest. It is green, of course, but also slightly silver. The monkey puzzle's scales catching sunlight at odd angles. The beech leaves translucent at their edges. The air smells of rain and bark and something faintly mineral from the volcanic rock underfoot. If you sit in a warm pool in a river like the Liukura, you might rest your head back against a sun-warmed stone and watch the sky between the tree canopies, which are not pressed tightly together the way a tropical rainforests would be, but spacious, each tree asserting its own clear space, giving the forest an open, airy quality full of light. Let your own body settle a little heavier now, the way it does when warmth moves through your muscles and they decide they can let go. The phenomenon that makes rivers like these warm is part of a much larger story about how the Earth manages its own internal heat. The planet formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago from the collapse of a cloud of gas and dust around a young star. As the material of the Earth gathered together, it heated up. The kinetic energy of all that matter colliding and compressing, turning into thermal energy, warming the interior of the young planet to temperatures far higher than we can easily imagine. The heaviest elements, like iron and nickel, sank toward the center under gravity, releasing still more heat as they fell. Radioactive elements distributed through the mantle and crust decay slowly, releasing heat in the process. And that decay is still happening today, 4.5 billion years later. The result is that the Earth's interior remains extraordinarily hot. The outer core, the liquid iron-nickel layer that surrounds the solid inner core, has temperatures comparable to the surface of the sun. The mantle above it, while cooler, is still hot enough that rock, which we think of as the very definition of solid and immovable, flows very slowly over geological timescales, driven by heat from below and cooling near the surface. This slow flowing is what drives the movement of tectonic plates, which in turn drives volcanoes and earthquakes and the slow rearrangement of continents. And at the very top of this enormous heat engine, in the thin, cool outermost skin of the planet, warm water seeps upward through cracks and finds its way to rivers, and we feel the distant echo of that ancient heat when we dip our hands into the flow. It is, when you let it settle in, an extraordinary thought. The warmth you would feel in the Liukura River, or in Shanai Timpishka, or in the hot springs of Iceland or Japan, is connected through a long chain of rock and time and slow movement to the very formation of the Earth itself. You are touching something that began 4.5 billion years ago, when a cloud of gas and dust found its center of gravity and began the slow, patient process of becoming a world. In Costa Rica, which sits above an active subduction zone where the Cocos Plate slides beneath the Caribbean Plate, there are geothermally heated rivers on the flanks of several volcanoes. The most accessible of these are near the Arenal volcano, a near-perfect cone that rose dramatically from the flat plains of the Central Highlands and spent several decades as one of the most consistently active volcanoes in the Western Hemisphere before entering a quieter phase. The rivers that flow from Arenal's slopes are warmed by the volcano's residual heat, and in some sections they pass through forests so lush and diverse that ecologists have spent decades studying just small sections of them without running out of new things to learn. The number of species in a Costa Rican rainforest, plants, insects, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fungi, and countless organisms too small to see with the naked eye, is so extraordinary that a single large tree can support hundreds of other species just within its bark and branches and root zone. Sitting beside a warm river in a place like this, you would be surrounded by life in every direction, at every scale. A leafcutter ant trail might cross the path near your feet. Those determined, purposeful columns of ants, each carrying a piece of leaf overhead like a tiny green sail, moving in both directions at once, following a scent trail laid down by the ants who came before. A hummingbird might appear and disappear from a nearby flower in the time it takes to blink, its wings beating so fast they are simply a blur, its whole tiny body a focused point of energy and purpose. And the warm river would move past you through all of this life, indifferent and generous and perfectly at ease. Some of the world's naturally heated rivers change color as the year moves through its seasons. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the subtle, gradual way that color changes in nature usually happen, so slowly that you might not notice unless you had been watching for a while, and then suddenly you realize that what was deep blue-green 3 months ago is now edged with amber, and what was amber has become a soft orange-red, and the whole river has been shifting through a private spectrum that has nothing to do with the seasons in the way we usually measure them by temperature or daylight, but instead reflects the growth cycles of the microbial communities living in the warm water. In Yellowstone, the grand prismatic spring changes its outermost rings from green in summer to orange and red as the colder months arrive. The temperature of the water itself doesn't change significantly. It is the microbes that respond to the change in sunlight and temperature in the surrounding air, producing more of the orange and red pigments that protect them during lower light seasons. So, the spring viewed from above is like a living thermometer, not of the water's heat, but of the season's feeling, painted in colors by organisms invisible to the naked eye. Scientists who study thermophils, the heat-loving microorganisms of hot springs and geothermal rivers, have found that these organisms are among the most ancient forms of life on Earth. When life first appeared on this planet, approximately 3.5 billion years ago, the Earth's surface was a very different place. Volcanic, hot, without free oxygen in the atmosphere, without ozone to shield the surface from ultraviolet radiation. The first living things were organisms adapted to exactly the conditions that we now think of as extreme. High heat, high acidity, chemical-rich water, intense radiation. They were, in essence, thermophiles. The discovery of thermophiles in Yellowstone's hot springs in the 1960s by a microbiologist named Thomas Brock was one of the genuinely transformative moments in the history of biology. It changed the understanding of where life could exist. Before Brock's work, it was generally assumed that water temperatures above about 50 degrees Celsius were too hot for any living organism to survive. Brock found them thriving at 90 degrees, and then at temperatures above boiling, and eventually at temperatures that seemed, by any previous reckoning, completely incompatible with life. The ripple effects of this discovery are still spreading. When scientists began wondering whether life might exist on other planets, in the ice-covered oceans of Jupiter's moon Europa, or in the subsurface of Mars, the existence of thermophils made those possibilities far more plausible. If life on Earth can thrive in conditions of extreme heat and acidity and chemical richness, then the range of places in the universe where life might have found a foothold becomes very large indeed. But you don't need to travel to other planets for wonder. The warm rivers of this world carry their own extraordinary inhabitants, doing what they have always done, coloring the water and building their delicate films on warm stones and living their microscopic lives with a completeness and a consistency that stretches back to the very dawn of life itself. If you are finding this story a peaceful companion tonight, please do feel free to like the video. It genuinely helps other people who might also be looking for a quiet place to rest find their way here. And there are more stories like this one in the playlist whenever you need them. In the Philippines, on the island of Negros, there is a river called the Mainit, a name that simply means hot in Filipino. The Mainit River runs from a geothermally active area of the island down toward the sea, and along much of its length, the water is warm enough to be comfortable for bathing, but not so hot as to be anything other than deeply pleasant. The riverbanks are lined with bamboo, that most generous and versatile of plants, which grows so fast in warm, moist climates that you can almost watch it move upward on a good day, each new shoot rising a foot or more in 24 hours, the whole grove breathing and swaying and filling the air with the soft, dry percussion sound of bamboo against bamboo in the wind. Bamboo is technically a grass, which is one of those facts that seems impossible until you sit with it for a moment, and then suddenly seems completely obvious. It is the world's fastest growing plant, and it flowers only rarely. Some species only once in decades. All members of the species flowering simultaneously, no matter where in the world they are growing, as if responding to a signal only they can hear, and then dying after seeding, making way for the next generation. The mystery of what triggers this synchronized flowering has never been fully explained, which is one of those gaps in our knowledge that is more beautiful than any answer might be. Near the Mainit River, the bamboo groves create a kind of living tunnel over the path, green and cool above, warm and misty near the water. The light filtered through layers of leaf that make everything below them soft and indirect. The sound of the warm river is present through the grove, not loud, but constant, like a voice you can hear without quite making out the words. The sound of water moving over smooth stones, deeper in the channels, lighter over the shallows, always moving, always warm. People in the communities near the Mainit River have been using its warm water for washing and bathing for generations. The river is part of the landscape of daily life in a way that is both completely practical and quietly sacred. The way that any source of reliable warmth in a place tends to become something people organize their lives around. In cooler months, when the air in the highland valleys can be unexpectedly chill at dawn and dusk, the warm river is even more valuable, offering what feels like a private gift from the earth. Let the feeling of warm water move through your imagination for a moment. The weight of it and the warmth, and the way it holds you very gently if you let it. In the Azores, the Portuguese archipelago that sits in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge, much as Iceland does, though with a more southerly and temperate climate. There is a tradition of cooking food in the ground near volcanic hot springs. In the village of Furnas on the island of São Miguel, restaurants dig pots of stew into the hot volcanic soil near the boiling springs and leave them there for 6 to 8 hours, letting the earth's own heat do the cooking. The resulting dish, cozido das furnas, is extraordinarily tender, slow-cooked by the same geothermal warmth that colors the springs nearby, yellow and orange and red. The hot springs of Furnas are spread through a park-like valley where the earth smells of sulfur and steam rises from holes in the ground in regular, unhurried intervals. The springs themselves are vivid, some deep blue, some creamy white from silica deposits, some rimmed with yellow sulfur crystals that build up in slowly growing rings around the edges of the vents. People walk between them on wooden boardwalks, and the combination of the warm steam and the strange colors and the smell of deep earth creates an atmosphere unlike almost anywhere else on the planet. The island of São Miguel has its own warm river, the Caldera Stream, which runs through the geothermally active Sete Cidades area and carries warmth borrowed from the volcanic system beneath the island. The Azores are also known for their extraordinary variety of hydrangeas, those large-flowered, cushion-like shrubs that bloom in every shade, from white through pink to the deepest indigo blue, lining roads and filling gardens and growing wild along riverbanks in numbers that, in peak summer, make the islands look like they have been carpeted in flowers. The blue of Azorean hydrangeas is particularly intense, caused by aluminum in the volcanic soil, which the plants absorb and use to intensify the pigment in their petals. The same volcanic geology that warms the rivers also feeds the extravagant color of the flowers. Everything connected, everything coming from the same slow, generous source. When you are beside a river that steams, something changes in the quality of the air around you. It becomes softer, more present. The steam catches light differently than ordinary air does. It diffuses it, scatters it, turns direct sunlight into something that comes from everywhere at once, rather than from one direction. On a clear day beside a warm river, you might find yourself sitting in a room of light without walls, everything illuminated equally and gently, without shadow. That kind of light is what you find around the boiling river in Yellowstone, a stretch of river near the Mammoth Hot Springs area, where a hot spring pours into the Gardner River, mixing hot and cold water to create a section that is warm enough for people to soak in on cool mornings. The steam above the mixing zone catches the early light and turns it golden. Visitors who arrive at dawn sometimes stand at the edge for a long moment before getting in, simply looking at the way the light is moving through the steam, because it is so quietly beautiful that they want to hold it in their attention before they do anything else. The Gardner River itself is fed by snowmelt from the high plateau of Yellowstone. Cold, clear water that has filtered through rock and emerged pure and cold into the mountain air. Where the hot spring enters, the two waters meet and negotiate. Warm and cold, mineral-rich and mineral-light, steaming and clear. And the result is a stretch of river with a temperature somewhere between, warm enough to be deeply comfortable, clear enough to see the pebbles on the bottom, moving with the gentle urgency of mountain water that knows it has somewhere to go. In cold seasons, bison sometimes walk through the boiling river area. Their enormous dark shapes moving through the steam on a winter morning, their breath adding its own white clouds to the already misty air, is one of those images that feels less like something you're seeing and more like something you're dreaming. The combination of elements, cold air, warm water, steam, enormous slow animals, early light, creates something that doesn't quite fit into ordinary categories. It is wild and peaceful and slightly unreal and completely, absolutely true. Bison once roamed the American Great Plains in numbers that are almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates suggest that before the 19th century, there may have been between 30 and 60 million bison across North America. Herds that stretched from horizon to horizon, that took days to pass, that the ground trembled under when they moved. The reduction of that population to fewer than 1,000 animals by the end of the 19th century is one of the saddest chapters in the history of the relationship between people and wildlife. The recovery of the bison population in places like Yellowstone, now numbering several thousand in the park, is one of the more hopeful ones. Watching a bison stand in the steam beside the boiling river, absolutely at ease, doing what bison have done in that place for far longer than any human memory reaches back, you might feel something that is hard to name precisely. A kind of gratitude, perhaps, that this animal is still here, still moving through morning light and steam, still occupying the earth in the large, unhurried way that bison have always occupied it. Let yourself be still for a moment in the same way. The water in naturally heated rivers often has a quality of particular softness, not the softness of filtered drinking water, but a different kind, related to the minerals the water carries. Some geothermal waters are rich in calcium and magnesium bicarbonates that give them a silky feeling against skin, as if the water is slightly thicker than usual, slightly more present. Others are high in dissolved silica, which has a similar softening effect. The famous silica-rich water of Iceland's Blue Lagoon has such a noticeably smooth, soft quality that first-time bathers often hold their hands up in front of them and look at them with mild surprise, as if wondering what has been done to the usual texture of the world. This mineral softness is part of why thermally heated waters have been used for bathing and healing across cultures for so long. The sensation of being in the water is simply different from ordinary bathing, more embracing somehow. The water seems more aware of you, or you of it. The distinction between your body and the water around you becomes slightly less clear, which is one of the things that makes floating in warm water such a reliable path to the particular relaxed state where thoughts slow down and the body stops reporting everything it usually reports, and you can simply be present without doing anything at all. In Turkey, the travertine pools of Pamukkale, which means cotton castle in Turkish, are fed by hot springs that emerge from a cliff above the Kuruksu River Valley. The water, rich in calcium carbonate, has deposited its mineral load over thousands of years in the form of brilliant white terraces that cascade down the hillside, each terrace forming a shallow pool of warm, mineral-rich water. From a distance, Pamukkale looks like a frozen waterfall, or perhaps a hillside covered in fresh snow that never melts, its white and pale blue terraces stepping down toward the valley below. The water temperature in the Pamukkale pools ranges between 35 and 100 degrees Celsius at the source, cooling as it flows down through the terraces. The lower terraces, where water from the springs has traveled further and cooled more, are comfortable for wading, warm and slightly slippery underfoot from the mineral deposits. The water clear enough to see your feet below you on the white travertine surface. The steam from the pools above drifting down over you in occasional gentle clouds. The ancient city of Hierapolis was built directly beside these springs, and its people used the warm waters for bathing and healing for many centuries. The ruins of the city still stand above the white terraces, columns and walls, and the outlines of ancient buildings, all in pale stone, looking out over the valley below in the company of the springs that have been flowing exactly as they always have through the rise and fall of the city above them. The springs don't know about the city. They were flowing before it was built, and they continued flowing after it was abandoned. This is not sad. It is one of the most settling facts in the world, that nature continues with complete equanimity through everything that human history brings. The water finds its way upward. The minerals settle into their white terraces. The steam rises. Regardless, Do check out the playlist if you haven't already. There are stories there about oceans and forests and quiet mountains, each one a different way of settling into the peace of the natural world. There are hot springs in the ocean, not on land at all, but beneath the sea, in places so deep that no sunlight has ever reached them, in water so cold that it would be below freezing if the pressure of all those kilometers of ocean above didn't keep it liquid. In these places, hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor pump water at temperatures up to 400 degrees Celsius out through chimneys of mineral deposit that have built up over years into structures sometimes as tall as a building. These are called black smokers, named for the dark, mineral-rich water that plumes from them like smoke from a chimney, though it is not smoke at all, but superheated water carrying dissolved minerals that precipitate out as soon as they meet the near-freezing ambient water of the deep ocean, forming dark clouds that slowly settle and add to the growing chimney structure below. The scale of what happens around hydrothermal vents, biologically speaking, is astonishing. In the complete darkness and extreme cold and pressure of the deep ocean around these scalding chimneys, entire ecosystems have developed that are entirely independent of sunlight. Where almost every other ecosystem on Earth ultimately depends on photosynthesis, on plants and algae and cyanobacteria converting sunlight into organic matter. Vent ecosystems are powered by chemosynthesis. The microorganisms at their base convert the chemicals in the hot vent water into energy, and everything else builds on that. Tube worms 3 meters long, dense beds of chemosynthetic bacteria, crabs and shrimp and fish adapted to this strange, lightless, pressure-filled world. Tube worms, the giant ones, Riftia pachyptila, have no mouth and no digestive tract. They are essentially hollow, filled with a tissue called a trophosome that houses billions of symbiotic bacteria. The worm and the bacteria have an arrangement. The worm brings the bacteria the chemical compounds they need, and the bacteria provide the worm with the organic molecules it needs to live. They have been doing this together for so long that neither could survive without the other. They have become each other, in a sense. This is a characteristic of life in these extreme environments. Intense, intimate cooperation. Everything depending on everything else. Every organism connected to its neighbors by bonds of chemistry and necessity that make the distinction between one living thing and another somewhat less clear than it might seem. You are part of a similar web of connections, even now, lying still in the dark. The bacteria in your gut, trillions of them, outnumbering your own cells, are doing their ancient cooperative work. Your breath moves oxygen to your cells and carries carbon dioxide away. Your heart beats its patient, reliable pattern. All of this without any effort or attention from you, systems working together in the same cooperating way that has been working in living things for billions of years. You can simply let it all happen. You don't need to do anything. Back near the surface now. Back to rivers you could actually stand beside, feeling the warm air on your face. In the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, one of the driest places on Earth, where some areas go decades between rainfall events, where the landscape is red and ochre and deep purple, where the salt flats look like the surface of another planet in the thin, high-altitude light. There are hot springs. The Tatio geysers, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters above sea level, are the largest geyser field in the southern hemisphere. And in the early morning, when the air temperature can drop well below freezing, the steam from the geysers and hot springs rises in columns that can be seen from miles away. The geysers of El Tatio are most active at dawn, which makes visiting them a venture into the cold, dark hours before sunrise. Wrapping yourself in layers of clothing, riding up through the pre-dawn darkness on a road that climbs steadily through the Altiplano, and arriving at the field as the first light begins to touch the horizon. In that combination of cold air and first light and rising steam, something happens to the ordinary divisions of the world. The ground steams, the sky brightens, the geysers pulse in irregular intervals, each eruption a few seconds of hot water and steam shooting upward before falling back and subsiding. The sound they make is a deep, rhythmic exhalation, like something breathing, and perhaps it is. The flamingos of the Atacama, 3 species of them, pink and improbable in this stark landscape, wade in the shallow, mineral-rich lagoons that sit near the geothermal areas, feeding on the algae and brine shrimp that can survive in the hypersaline, chemically intense water. Flamingos, which we associate with lush, tropical settings, are in fact extraordinarily adaptable, thriving at altitude in cold, mineral-rich, geothermally influenced waters that would be hostile to almost anything else. They stand in the water on their stilt legs, their curved beaks working in the water, their pink reflected in the still surface, entirely at ease. The pink of a flamingo comes from the carotenoid pigments in the algae and crustaceans they eat. A flamingo fed on a diet without carotenoids would gradually turn white. They are, in a very real sense, the color of their food, which is one of those facts that feels like a small, quiet key to something larger about the connection between living things and the places they live. You are shaped by what surrounds you too, in more ways than you might usually think about. Rain falls on mountains, and the mountains hold it for a while. Some of the rain runs off immediately, finding the quickest path downhill through channels it has carved over centuries, carrying small pieces of the mountain with it toward the sea. Some soaks into the soil and is taken up by roots, cycled through leaves, returned to the atmosphere through transpiration in a soft, invisible exhalation from a million leaf surfaces, and some sinks deeper, past the soil, past the root zone, down through the rock itself, along cracks and grain boundaries, and through porous zones in the stone, drawn by gravity toward whatever space will receive it. This deep, percolating water moves very slowly. In some formations it moves only millimeters per year, tracked with isotope analysis, scientists can trace where water came from: high mountain snowmelt, or lowland rain, or ancient precipitation from centuries past, and how long it has been underground, and what temperature rock it has passed through. The water that emerges in a geothermal hot spring might have last been open-air water during the reign of a long-dead dynasty, or during an ice age, or during a time when humans had not yet reached the continent. It now emerges in. There is something deeply humbling about that, and deeply peaceful. Time, at the scale at which water moves through rock, makes human timescales very small and very gentle. Not meaningless, but nested inside something so much larger that the urgency of any individual moment becomes easier to set aside. In Japan, the concept of emma describes meaningful emptiness, the pause between notes, the space between objects, the silence within which sound has meaning. It is a concept applied to music and architecture and garden design and the arrangement of stones in a rocking garden. But you might also apply it to the time water spends underground. Those years or centuries of slow, dark movement through rock, gathering warmth and minerals before it surfaces again in a spring or a warm river. That long pause is not empty. It is full of change, full of transformation, full of the slow alchemy of water becoming something richer and warmer than it was when it began. The spring that emerges at the end of that journey is, in a sense, the resolution of an enormous and very slow piece of music. Let yourself be in the pause for a moment, in the space between things. Rwanda, in East Africa, has several geothermal springs in the Virunga volcano region, where the chain of volcanoes forms part of the Albertine Rift, the western branch of the Great East African Rift System, where the African continent is, on a geological timescale, beginning to split apart. The Virunga volcanoes are famous for being one of the last places on Earth where mountain gorillas still survive in the wild. Those extraordinary, gentle, deeply intelligent animals who share about 98% of their genetic material with humans and who live in family groups with social structures, emotional lives, and individual personalities that are unmistakably, movingly familiar. The gorillas of the Virunga regularly visit geothermal springs in their territory. They use the warm water to drink, and the mineral-rich springs may provide nutrients that supplement their primarily plant-based diet. The sight of a mountain gorilla sitting quietly beside a steaming spring in the cool mountain forest, at altitudes where the temperature can be unexpectedly chilly, wrapped in that thick, dark fur, is one of the most extraordinary things that the world contains. Gorillas at rest have an almost meditative quality. A large silverback sitting with his back against a tree and his arms resting loosely on his knees, eyes half closed, simply being present in the forest. He looks in that moment like something that knows something you might still be learning, about staying still, about not needing to do anything, about the sufficiency of simply being here, breathing, warm, surrounded by the sounds of the forest. In the 1970s and 1980s, the mountain gorilla population had declined to somewhere around 250 individuals. The work of researchers and conservationists over the following decades, sometimes in difficult and dangerous circumstances, has brought that number up to more than 1,000 today. It is one of the genuine conservation success stories of the modern era, and the gorillas, of course, know nothing about it. They continue to move through their forest, eating plants and grooming each other and resting by warm springs in the same way they always have. The warm springs of the Virunga are part of a landscape that has been changing very slowly for millions of years and will continue to change for millions more. The volcanoes are active. Nyiragongo, the most active of them, has a permanent lava lake in its crater, one of only a few in the world, glowing red in the night sky above the forest. The warmth that heats the springs nearby is the same warmth that fills that lava lake. Connected, all of it, all the way from the glowing summit down through the rock to the warm water that a mountain gorilla drinks on a cool morning in the forest below. If you are still awake and enjoying this journey, please do feel free to like the video and to leave a comment. It means a great deal, and it helps others who might need a quiet place like this one to find their way here. In the Kamchatka Peninsula of far eastern Russia, one of the most remote and wild places on Earth, where rivers run clean and cold and bears are more numerous than people. There are geothermal springs and warm rivers scattered through a volcanic landscape that looks, in some places, like the Earth has only just finished deciding what shape it wants to be. Kamchatka has 29 active volcanoes and many more dormant ones, and the geothermal activity associated with them warms springs and rivers across enormous areas of the peninsula. Brown bears in Kamchatka use the warm springs in winter, gathering in the geothermal areas where the warm ground makes it easier to find food and where the thermally warmed rivers provide better fishing. In summer, when the Pacific salmon run upriver to spawn, the bears concentrate at falls and rapids, watching the water with a focused patience, and then moving with sudden, fluid speed to catch a fish that a moment before seemed uncatchable. A Kamchatka brown bear catching salmon at a waterfall and then sitting on a rock to eat it, shaking the water from its fur, watching the river with its amber eyes, entirely occupied with the immediate, simple fact of eating, is an image of complete presence, not planning or remembering or worrying, just here, just now, just this. That kind of presence is available to you, too, right now. The breath you are taking, the weight of your body settled and warm, the sounds of wherever you are, just this. The sound of a geothermally heated river is different from an ordinary one in a way that is subtle but real. Most rivers sound primarily of water, the clean percussion of water over stones, the hollow notes of deeper channels, the occasional splash of something falling, or a fish jumping in the evening light. A warm river has all of this, but underneath it, if you are close enough and the conditions are right, there is something else. a very soft, low bubbling that comes from where the hot springs enter the river, from the gas dissolved in the warm water, releasing as it meets cooler surface conditions. It is a gentle sound, barely present, more felt in the chest than heard distinctly. It gives the river a quality of gentle respiration. You might lie on the bank of such a river and put your ear close to the water, the way children sometimes put their ears to the ground to feel the vibration of something distant. You would hear the river differently from that angle. The surface close to your ear, the sound filling that side of your head, the warm air from the water's surface touching your cheek. The world would contract to that. The sound of warm water moving, the touch of humid air, the smell of minerals and mud, and green things growing at the river's edge. There is a practice in some forms of meditation and sound therapy of attending to water sound specifically. Rivers, rain, slow-running streams, because of the particular way they engage the auditory system. The patterns of water sound are complex enough to hold attention and prevent the mind from generating its own distracting narratives, but not so complex or rhythmic that they demand any active processing. They exist in the space between the organized and the random, which is exactly where the resting mind wants to go. Not silence, which can be its own kind of alertness, but sound without meaning, sensation without content. Rivers sound as a hammock for the mind. In southern Iceland, near the town of Hveragerði, which translates roughly as hot spring garden, geothermal heat is so abundant that tomatoes and bananas and tropical flowers are grown in greenhouses heated entirely by hot spring water in a country where the winters are long and dark and the outdoor growing season extremely limited. Walking through these greenhouses is a strange and lovely experience. Outside, the subarctic landscape of low scrub and lava fields and distant mountains dusted with snow. Inside, tropical warmth and the dense green smell of growing things. Tomato plants reaching to the ceiling, the sound of water moving in the heating system below. The Varma River near Hveragerði is warmed by geothermal springs and runs distinctly warm through the valley. It is one of the places where the boundary between the cultivated and the wild becomes interesting. Warm water flowing through an otherwise cold landscape, creating a microenvironment where plants that would not normally survive in Iceland can establish themselves in sheltered spots along the banks, attracted by the warmth. The concept of a microenvironment, a small area with conditions different from the surrounding landscape, created by a particular geological or topographic feature, is one of the quiet magics of ecology. A warm river in a cold landscape creates a microenvironment where different things are possible. A sheltered south-facing cliff face can be warm enough in a generally cold region for plants that need more sun. A deep forest creates its own humidity and dampness. A single large rock in a field creates a shelter from wind on one side and a sun trap on the other. And in both places, different small creatures make their homes. The world, at these small scales, is enormously various. There are creatures and plants and fungi doing things right now in microenvironments so small and specific that no human being has ever particularly noticed them, that are completely extraordinary. The moss cushion on the north side of a stone, with its own moisture regime and temperature and community of microscopic invertebrates. The root zone of a single old tree, its chemistry and microbiology as distinct as any ecosystem. The edge of a warm spring where the temperature gradient from hot to cold runs across a few centimeters, and each centimeter is home to a different community of organisms precisely calibrated to that exact temperature. Life fills every available space with the same patient thoroughness that water fills every available hollow. It finds every crack and gradient and microenvironment and makes itself at home. You could think of sleep as a kind of microenvironment too, a small particular world with its own conditions, its own creatures, the images and narratives of dreams, its own chemistry and temperature and light, a world you move into every night, traveling from one to the other with the ease of long practice, settling into it the way a warm river settles into its banks. The transition from waking to sleep is one of the gentlest of all the transitions available to a person. You don't have to do anything to make it happen. You simply stop doing other things, and it arrives on its own. In Ethiopia, the Rift Valley contains one of the most remarkable concentrations of geothermal activity in the world. Stretching from the Red Sea in the north, through Kenya and Tanzania toward Mozambique in the south, the East African Rift is a place where the African continent is being pulled apart by the movement of tectonic plates, creating a valley hundreds of kilometers wide and thousands of kilometers long, lined with volcanoes and hot springs and extraordinary, often mineral-rich lakes. Lake Bogoria in Kenya is an alkaline, saline lake fed by hot springs along its shoreline that bubble and steam year-round. The lake's chemical conditions are so extreme, highly alkaline, rich in cyanobacteria, that very few animals can survive in it. But lesser flamingos, which can filter the cyanobacteria from the water and are largely unaffected by the alkalinity that would burn the skin of most other creatures, congregate on Lake Bogoria in numbers that can reach into the hundreds of thousands. Seen from a hillside above the lake, this gathering is one of the most extraordinary visual spectacles in the natural world. The lake's surface visible between the hills in patches of pale blue and silver, and along its edges and shallows, a dense, continuous band of deep pink that shifts and moves and is never quite still, as if the lake has grown a living edge that breathes and turns in the light. The hot springs along Lake Bogoria's shore shoot water several meters into the air at regular intervals, steaming columns rising against the blue sky, the ground around them stained yellow and orange with sulfur deposits. The flamingos feed not far from these springs, wading in water that would be uncomfortable for almost anything else, apparently entirely at ease with the heat and the chemicals and the scale of their own gathering. The relationship between heat and color in the natural world is one of the most consistently beautiful facts there is. Not just in geothermal springs and warm rivers, but everywhere. The orange red of autumn leaves as chlorophyll breaks down and the underlying pigments become visible. The reddening of the sky at sunset as light passes through more atmosphere. The yellowing of grasses in dry heat. The way desert rocks turn more deeply red and orange in the warm hours of afternoon. The visible spectrum of light, scattered and absorbed and reflected differently by different temperatures and conditions, writes the story of heat across the surface of the world in color. In the geothermal areas of Yellowstone, where thermophilic microorganisms paint the springs in extraordinary shades, the connection between heat and color is at its most direct and legible. You can read the temperature of a spring from its color with a fair degree of accuracy. Deep blue at the center means very hot, too hot for most life. Turquoise and green means somewhat cooler, the first microbes appearing. Yellow and orange and red at the edges means cooler still, a different community taking over. The spring is a thermometer that paints itself. At Norris Geyser Basin in Yellowstone, the hottest and most dynamic thermal area in the park, the landscape shifts colors so continuously that regular visitors describe it as never looking exactly the same twice. New springs open, old ones seal with mineral deposits. Temperatures change. Acid pools shift their chemistry. An area that was orange last month might be yellow this month, or white with silica deposits, or black from microbial mats that have established themselves where the conditions finally suit them. The dynamism of geothermal areas is part of what makes them feel so alive. Unlike most landscapes, which change slowly and by degrees that are difficult to perceive without years of observation, geothermal areas can change noticeably over days or weeks. A new hot spring might open in a meadow that was ordinary grass last year. A geyser might change its eruption interval or stop erupting altogether, or begin erupting from a new vent. The ground itself can sink or rise slightly as water levels in underground reservoirs change. It is a living landscape in the most literal sense, moving and changing and responding to conditions, never quite finished, never static. The geysers of Yellowstone are perhaps the most theatrical expression of geothermal energy. Water heated to above its normal boiling point by proximity to very hot rock stored under pressure in underground chambers until the pressure reaches a threshold and the water flashes to steam and the whole column erupts upward through a constricted vent with a sound somewhere between a rush and a roar. Old Faithful, the most famous geyser in the world, erupts on average every 90 minutes, though the interval varies. It has been erupting since long before any European explorer arrived in the Yellowstone region, watched by indigenous peoples for whom the geyser basin was a sacred and significant landscape. The Crow, Shoshone, Bannock, and other nations had deep knowledge of Yellowstone's thermal features, and for them, these places were not primarily spectacles or curiosities, but important parts of a landscape they knew intimately and moved through regularly over thousands of years. When an eruption of Old Faithful begins, there is a brief, suspenseful pause, the water beginning to churn in the vent, small pre-eruption splashes of hot water, and then the column rises, 10, 20, 30, finally 40 or more meters of hot water and steam shooting into the air, hanging for a moment at its peak before the pressure drops and it falls back around the vent in a curtain of smaller streams. The whole eruption lasts 2 to 5 minutes. Then the geyser quiets, the steam thins, and the landscape returns to its between-eruption calm. Just the low bubbling of the vent, the steam drifting sideways in whatever breeze is moving across the plateau. In winter, when the Yellowstone Plateau is deep under snow and the air temperature can drop to minus 40 degrees, the geyser eruptions produce extraordinary clouds of steam that freeze on contact with the cold air and fall back as snow and ice crystals, coating the surrounding rocks and the nearby trees in white, building delicate, temporary sculptures of ice that catch the winter light and sparkle briefly before the next eruption disturbs them. Please do remember to check the playlist on this channel. There are other quiet stories there, and they are always ready for you whenever you need them. A forest at night, the sounds of ocean, the long patience of mountains, the great boiling spring in Nevada, part of a geothermal area in the Black Rock Desert, is one of the largest naturally occurring hot springs in the United States. A pool roughly the size of a small lake, its surface steaming year-round, its water a deep, extraordinary blue that seems almost luminous in certain lights. The spring is fed by a geothermal system that has been active for many thousands of years. The water temperature at the center hovering just below boiling. The Black Rock Desert, where the spring sits, is one of the most austere and beautiful landscapes in North America. A vast, flat playa of cracked white lake bed, ringed by dark mountains, the sky above it enormous and largely empty, the silence deep and pervasive except for the wind. The presence of a large, steaming, intensely blue pool in the middle of this austere flatness has an almost surreal quality, like discovering that the desert has a secret, warm interior self that it keeps quiet. At dawn, when the sun first touches the mountains to the east and the playa is still in shadow, the steam from the great boiling spring rises vertically in the still air, a single soft column visible for miles, marking the location of the hot water. The way smoke from a fire marks a camp. The first light touches it and turns it gold. Water carries stories. Each river has its own. The mountains it comes from, the rock it has traveled through, the minerals it carries, the temperature gradient along its length from cold source to warm spring to cool lower reaches. Reading a river is like reading a very long, very slow book in a language that is entirely sensory. Temperature, color, smell, the sound of it, the plants at its edges, the creatures in its current. The Rio Caliente in Mexico. There are several rivers of this name, which simply means hot river, runs through landscapes, where volcanic activity has warmed its sources. In the state of Jalisco, the Rio Caliente feeds a series of natural pools and thermal spas that have been used for centuries. The warm water emerging from springs in a forested canyon and flowing over smooth, pale stones worn by centuries of water movement into forms as smooth and deliberate seeming as sculpture. The canyon walls above the river are hung with ferns and mosses that love the warm, humid air rising from the water below. Epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants rather than in soil, taking their nutrients from the air and rainwater, cluster on the trees overhanging the river, their roots gripping bark, their leaves turned at angles to catch the diffuse light filtering down through the canopy. Some of these epiphytes are bromeliads, members of the pineapple family, with the characteristic rosette of stiff, channeled leaves that collect rainwater in a central cup, creating a small private pool that becomes home to tree frogs and aquatic insects, and sometimes the larvae of mosquitoes, which are in turn eaten by the tree frogs, making each bromeliad a tiny, self-contained ecosystem. The tree frogs of Central and Mexican forests are among the most beautiful small animals in the world. Jewel bright, almost improbably colored, their skin so smooth it looks polished, their eyes enormous in proportion to their small faces, with that sideways considering gaze that makes them seem perpetually thoughtful. A red-eyed tree frog clinging to a bromeliad leaf above a warm river, its bright green back and red eyes catching the morning light, its sticky toe pads gripping the leaf with apparent effortlessness, is one of those images that feels like a small gift from the world, a reminder that it contains more color and form and delicacy than any ordinary day makes visible. At night, the warm canyons of the Rio Caliente are full of sound. Frogs call in overlapping choruses, each species with its own particular pattern, some rapid and high, some slower and more resonant, the whole creating a tapestry of sound that fills the canyon from water level to canopy. Insects add their own layers, the steady background pulse of crickets, the occasional higher note of something else. An owl calls from further up the canyon, its sound carrying clearly through the warm night air. And beneath all of it, continuous and patient, the sound of the warm river moving over its smooth stones. There is a quality of nighttime sound in warm, forested places, particularly near warm water, that is extraordinarily full and alive. The density of life in tropical and subtropical forests means that the night is never quiet in the way that, say, a desert night can be quiet. There is always something calling, something moving, something making its presence known in sound. But after a while, this richness of sound becomes its own kind of quiet. Too complex to follow, too continuous to be alarming, becoming instead a kind of auditory warmth that holds the listener the way a blanket holds someone settling towards sleep. The warm river running through it all, steady, unhurried, carrying its minerals and its borrowed heat, is the constant beneath the variable sounds. In Peru, beyond the Amazon watershed and into the mountains, hot springs emerge from the Andes in several places, fed by the volcanic activity that runs the length of the mountain chain. The small town of Aguas Calientes, Hot Waters, sits at the base of the mountain on which Machu Picchu stands, warmed by the springs that give it its name. The town is framed by steep, cloud-covered mountains, and the springs that bubble up at its edges are used by both locals and visitors who arrive at the end of a long day of walking and find the warm pools a complete and perfect counterpoint to all that exertion. Machu Picchu itself, the great Inca citadel on the mountain above, was built in a region rich in geothermal activity. The Inca understood the significance of warm springs and incorporated them into religious and ceremonial life, constructing fountains and water channels that guided spring water through temples and plazas, making the movement of warm water a visible and audible part of sacred space. The Inca concept of water as something living, something that moved between the human world and the sacred, something that carried messages between the seen and unseen worlds, is expressed in the architecture of their most sacred sites, in the precise, thoughtful engineering of their waterworks. Every channel, every fountain, every basin was positioned and carved with attention that goes beyond mere utility. Water was honored with the same care that stone and sky were honored. There is something to that approach. To treat water, the rain, the river, the warm spring, as something living and worthy of attention, not as a resource or a utility or a thing that simply is there, but as something with its own character, its own story, its own relationship to the world it moves through. The warm spring that feeds a river in Peru, the hot spring that warms a Japanese bathing pool, the geothermal vent that feeds a river in the Amazon jungle. Each of these is water that has traveled a long, particular journey to arrive at the surface. Each has come through rock and heat and time. Each carries something of where it has been. The quietest of all naturally warm rivers are those you might walk past without knowing what they are. Rivers that run only slightly above ambient temperature, warmed by low-grade geothermal activity, so gentle that the difference is a few degrees, enough to make the river's banks unusually lush and the water unusually comfortable for bathing, but not enough to produce visible steam except on the coldest mornings. These anonymous warm rivers exist in many places, tucked into valleys in volcanic island chains, running through the foothills of mountain ranges with geothermal activity in their deeper roots, threading between the fields and forests of regions where the Earth's heat is close to the surface, but not dramatically expressed. Their warmth is a quiet fact known mainly to the people who live nearby, who have learned to notice the difference, who perhaps grew up bathing in the river on autumn evenings when the air turned cold and found the water gentler than it should have been. There is a particular kind of local knowledge that involves knowing what a place does that is not obvious to anyone arriving there for the first time. Knowing which side of the valley warms up first in the morning, or where the first wildflowers appear each spring, or which stretch of the river runs warm. This knowledge is built up over years and generations of paying attention, and it belongs to places in a way that written knowledge does not quite manage. The Maori of New Zealand have a concept, kaitiakitanga, which translates approximately as guardianship or stewardship of the natural world. The responsibility of people to look after the land, water, and living things of the places they inhabit, not as owners, but as caretakers. This concept extends to geothermal waters, which hold particular significance in Maori cosmology and tradition. Many of the hot springs and thermally warmed rivers of New Zealand's North Island are embedded in Maori stories and in the living practice of iwi tribes, who regard them as rangatawa, taonga, as treasured features of a landscape that is not separate from, but continuous with the people living in it. Near the town of Rotorua, the thermally warmed streams and lakes have been used for cooking, bathing, and healing for many generations. The hangi, the traditional earth oven, is particularly associated with geothermal areas where the natural heat of the ground can be used directly for cooking. Food wrapped in leaves and lowered into a geothermally heated pit, left for hours as the earth's own warmth does its patient work, emerges with a particular flavor and texture that is specific to this cooking method. Tender, infused with mineral traces from the steam, slow cooked to a completeness that a faster method cannot achieve. There is patience in that kind of cooking, an acceptance that good things take the time they take, that trying to hurry them serves no one, that the best result comes from preparing everything carefully and then simply waiting. The earth will do what the earth does. On the schedule the earth keeps. You might let your own schedule loosen a little now. Let the night have its own timing. The deep-sea hydrothermal vents we spoke of earlier, those remarkable chimneys of mineral deposit on the ocean floor, pumping scalding water into the cold darkness, were only discovered by humans in 1977. Before that, it had been assumed that the deep ocean floor was essentially a desert, cold, dark, under crushing pressure, with very little life. The discovery of vent ecosystems was one of the most significant scientific surprises of the 20th century. Entire communities of organisms thriving in conditions previously thought to be incompatible with life, arranged around chimneys of hot, mineral-rich water in the complete absence of sunlight, thousands of meters below the surface. One of the researchers on the 1977 expedition that discovered the vents, a scientist named Cindy Lee Van Dover, who went on to become one of the world's foremost deep-sea biologists, described the moment of discovery as the most profound experience of her scientific life. The submarine's lights illuminating the bottom where they expected bare mud, and instead finding these extraordinary white formations rising from the seafloor, surrounded by life in every direction. Tube worms swaying, crabs moving slowly over the mineral chimneys, pale fish hanging in the water nearby, everything bathed in the blue light of the submarine's own lamps in that absolute darkness. She described feeling in that moment that the ocean had kept this secret for as long as humans had been asking questions about it, and had simply been there, complete and extraordinary, and entirely independent of human knowledge, doing what it always does. The warm rivers of the surface carry something of the same quality. They have been warm for longer than anyone has known about them. They will be warm long after. The knowledge of them is relatively recent, but the rivers themselves are ancient, patient and consistent, and entirely unaware of being discovered. If this story is accompanying you toward sleep, please do feel free to like the video and leave a comment, even just to say you were here. It is a small, warm thing to do, and much appreciated. In the Carpathian Mountains of Eastern Europe, that curving range that runs through Slovakia, Poland, Romania, and Ukraine, there are mineral springs that have been known and used since Roman times, and probably long before. The water that rises from these springs is often slightly carbonated and mineral-rich, carrying the taste of the rock it has traveled through. In some places it is warm, and in some places it is cold, but the mineral content gives all of it a character and a specificity that plain water does not have. The spa towns of the Carpathian region, places like Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic, Bardejov in Slovakia, Truskavec in Ukraine, developed around these springs as places where the people came to drink the mineral waters and soak in the warm baths, resting from the ordinary demands of their lives in an atmosphere of steady, undemanding warmth. The architecture of these towns, the ornate colonnades, the pump houses with their rows of tall windows letting in light, the parks and promenades laid out along the rivers, was designed to serve rest and recovery, to make being warm and still and slow into an accepted, even encouraged activity. There is something important in that social acknowledgement, the recognition that rest is not idleness, that warmth and stillness are genuinely restorative, that a body and a mind that have been given time simply to sit in warm water and do nothing will be better for it. The spa tradition, whatever its excesses and affectations over the centuries, contains this genuine insight at its center. Warmth and rest and time are healing. Some warm rivers smell of the earth in ways that are immediately and pleasantly distinct from any other smell. Hydrogen sulfide, the mineral compound associated with volcanic activity and geothermal waters, has a distinctive smell that is sometimes described as sulfurous, sometimes as the smell of hard-boiled eggs, sometimes as something more complicated and harder to categorize. In small concentrations, in the open air beside a warm spring, it is not unpleasant at all. It is simply the smell of the deep earth released to the surface, mineral and warm and slightly sharp, dissipating quickly in any breeze. People who have spent time in geothermally active areas often develop a fondness for this smell. It becomes associated with warm water, with rest, with the extraordinary landscapes of hot springs and geysers, with all the quiet wonder those places contain, catching it unexpectedly elsewhere in a damp basement or near a paper mill, they feel a momentary, slightly confusing sense of displacement, as if the smell has arrived without the landscape that should accompany it. Smell is the most directly emotional of the senses, the one most closely connected in the brain's architecture to memory and feeling. Scents bypass the usual routes of processing and arrive directly in the limbic system, where emotional memories live. This is why a particular smell can trigger not just a memory, but the emotional state associated with it, the feeling of being in that place at that time, not remembered so much as briefly re-inhabited. The smell of warm mineral water, if you have encountered it before, might bring you some part of the landscapes we have been moving through tonight. A Yellowstone morning, a Japanese onsen in winter, the steaming canyon of the Rio Caliente, the banks of Shanai Timpishka in the Amazon jungle. If you have not encountered it before, perhaps by the end of this story, you will have built enough of an association that someday, when you do smell it for the first time, it will feel familiar in a way you can't quite account for. The world's geothermal areas are distributed unevenly, concentrated along the boundaries of tectonic plates, where the Earth's interior heat finds its easiest pathways to the surface. The Ring of Fire, that circum-Pacific zone of volcanic and seismic activity, accounts for much of the world's geothermal surface activity, running along the western coasts of the Americas, across the Aleutian Islands, down through Japan and the Philippines, and Indonesia and New Zealand. Within this broad zone, the intensity of geothermal activity varies enormously from place to place, concentrated in areas of active volcanism or recent tectonic movement. Indonesia, which sits at the junction of three major tectonic plates and has more active volcanoes than any other country on Earth, has extraordinary geothermal resources distributed across its thousands of islands. The island of Java alone has several geothermal areas with warm rivers and hot springs, and similar features occur across Sumatra, Sulawesi, and the lesser islands of the eastern archipelago. On the island of Flores, in the Kelimutu volcanic complex, there are 3 crater lakes perched at the summit of the volcano, each a different color, and those colors change unpredictably and for reasons not yet fully understood over periods of months or years. One lake might be deep green, another turquoise, the third a dark brownish red. Then, over months, one will shift toward white, another toward black. The changes are related to the geochemistry of the hydrothermal activity feeding each lake from below, as the composition of the volcanic gases changes, altering the chemistry of the water and thus its color. The local Leo people of Flores regard the lakes as sacred, the resting place of the souls of the recently dead, each lake for a different type of person. The elders and the young go to one lake, the wicked to another, the good to the third. The colors changing are the souls settling, or the lakes responding to the lives being brought to them. It is a cosmology that takes the geological reality these genuinely extraordinary, genuinely mysterious, genuinely changing lakes, and finds in it a story about continuity, about where people go after their lives end, about the landscape holding those who have passed through it. It is one of the most beautiful examples of the human tendency to find meaning in the beautiful mysteries the earth offers, not to explain them away, not to be frightened by them, but to weave them into the fabric of understanding, to let them become part of how the world makes sense. Near the base of Kelimutu, the warm springs that leak from the volcano's flanks feed small streams that run through the forest toward the sea. These streams are warm enough to be comfortable, clear, running over dark volcanic rock that shows every small detail of the bottom. The forest at this altitude on Flores is full of birds that exist nowhere else in the world. Species that evolved in the specific conditions of this island over millions of years and have become entirely themselves, different from anything on any neighboring island, carrying in their colors and songs the particular history of Flores and the volcanic soil and the warm streams that have fed this ecosystem. Let your body be completely still now, if it wants to be. Let the story move without you. The volcanic archipelago of Vanuatu in the southwestern Pacific has rivers and springs warmed by the extraordinary geothermal activity associated with the New Hebrides subduction zone, where the Australian plate slides beneath the Pacific plate. The island of Ambrim has one of the most intense volcanic environments in the Pacific. 2 active lava lakes in adjacent craters, the ground warm underfoot across wide areas, sulfur vents breathing steam continuously through the rock. On the flanks of Ambrim's volcanoes, rivers run warm through a landscape that is harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Black volcanic soil, sparse vegetation near the volcanic areas, dense jungle beginning where the conditions allow it. The smell of sulfur in the air giving way to the green smell of forest as you walk downstream. The people of Ambrim have lived with this volcanic landscape for thousands of years, developing in that time a culture and a set of practices that take the volcano as a given, as part of the world as it is, rather than something exceptional or threatening. The sand drawings of Ambrim, elaborate, continuous geometric patterns drawn in a single unbroken line in sand or soil, used for communication and ceremony, are one of the cultural traditions associated with this island. The patterns are complex and specific, each carrying particular meaning, drawn with a practiced ease that comes from years of practice, the hand moving surely through the design, without lifting, tracing a path that connects the beginning to the end without interruption. There is something in that image, a continuous line, connecting beginning to end, moving without lifting, that feels like a useful way to think about the journey we have been making tonight. From Shanai Timpishka in the Amazon, to the snow monkeys of Japan, to the flamingos of Kenya, to the volcanic rivers of Indonesia and Vanuatu, a line has been drawn, warm and continuous, touching all these places. Close your eyes if they aren't closed already. Let the night hold you exactly as warm as you need to be. Everything is fine. The earth is warm beneath you. The world is very old and very patient and very, very good. Rest now. You are home. The Sleepy Nature Channel.